folks. Thank you for attending the Climate Legislation Forum. Just to give you a quick introduction, the panel will be given about 5 minutes to talk when we start asking questions. There are some cards that are floating around. If Debbie has some there, as well as Joel. So if anyone has any questions that they think they could ask for a card and get it filled out. If we find duplications of questions, we're going to try to consolidate them, so that way we don't ask the same question over and over again. Thank you, panel, for attending this. We really do appreciate you coming for this, as well as the audience for attending as well. So with that, we're going to have Reverend Tracy Robinson Harris come up for a little prayer.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for being here, and thanks to all of you for your presence and participation in this evening as well. This past December, 15-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who is the inspiration for school walkouts supporting climate justice, spoke on behalf of Climate Justice Now at the UN Climate Change Conference in Katowice, Poland. National leaders had gathered there to address the policy implications of climate crisis mitigation, recommendations that had been made 2 months earlier by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is what Greta told those leaders. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity. And if solutions within the system are so impossible to find, maybe we should change the system itself. We have run out of excuses, and we are running out of time. We are running out of time. The UN report, when it was issued last October, gave us 12 years to pursue systemic changes. 12 years to pursue unprecedented, rapid, far-reaching systemic changes if we are to avert a climate catastrophe. My prayer for us is that we do not burden our children and their children by our failure to act. We can't afford it, and they may not survive it. May our actions create a legacy our children will speak of as courageous, innovative, and determined action. And may we leave a legacy that is a thriving, livable planet for our children and theirs to the 7th generation. Thanks to each and all of you for what you are doing and will do, what we are doing and will do together.
Okay. We have a great panel tonight to address these issues. First, we have Senate President Karen Spilka, who represents Metro West communities of Ashland, Framingham, Franklin, Holliston, Hopkinton, Medway, and Natick, which comprise the 2nd Middlesex and Norfolk District. Before being voted as president by her Senate colleagues, she served as the chair of the Massachusetts Senate Committee on Ways and Means beginning in January 2015. Prior to that, she served as the Senate Majority Whip, 2013 to 2015, Assistant Majority Whip, 2012 to 13, and chair of the Joint Committee on Economic Development and Emerging Technologies 2019 to 2012, and chair of the Joint Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities from 2005 to 2009, a committee she helped originate. She began her legislative career as a state representative for the 7th Middlesex District in 2001. Maria Duane, how do you pronounce your middle name? Duane. Maria Duane Robinson was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 2018. She brings to the State House a decade of experience working in the clean, advanced energy industry. Her experience ranges from working with the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources to deploy solar panels at municipal water and wastewater facilities, to working in state legislators and agencies in over half the country to advocate clean air regulations, to provide expert testimony in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Representative Robinson also worked for now Governor Jay Inslee in his term in the U.S. House of Representatives. We also have James Eldridge, who has served as state senator for the Middlesex and Worcester districts since January of 2009. He currently serves as the Senate chair of the Joint Committee on the Judiciary. James Eldridge is known as a leader in the progressive issues and has filed the Medicare for All Act, the 100% Renewable Energy Act, the 100% Debt-Free Higher Education Act, and the Safe Community Acts, as well as many bills aimed at reducing the wealth gap, increasing affordable housing options, reforming the criminal justice system, and we will hear tonight how to be protecting the environment. We also have Carmine Gentile, and State Representative Carmine Gentile represents constituents in Framingham, Marlborough, Sudbury, and Wayland. He is beginning his 3rd term in the House and serves on the Energy and Environmental Subcommittees of the House Progressive Caucus and on the Caucus Steering Committee. This session, he is presenting a resolve to form a commission to plan for transitioning to energy neutral for all residential and commercial construction in the Commonwealth. So with that, if we can just go down the line, or we can start with President Spilka. Mic's in front of you if you want to do a quick introduction. Should be live.
Can you hear me? Okay, now it's on, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Larry, thank you, Reverend, and thank you to all of the folks that are here who I know work so hard in organizing tonight and this event. It's really important. I thank you to my colleagues, Jamie and Carmine and Maria. It's great to be here. I just want to give a little bit of an overview of what we did very briefly last year to bring you up to why last year was great, and we made some progress, but my belief is it wasn't sufficient, and I'm hoping that we do more, quite a bit more. So in August of 2018, we did have a bill that was signed into law. The Senate did a version of the bill which I believed that was bold and acknowledged the climate crisis, and I agree with everything that you said, Reverend, that we need to act now. The time of incremental small steps is over. We need to be much bolder. The Senate version of the bill, just to let you know, because some of it did not end up in the final conference committee, so I'm hoping that when we do another bill this legislative session, that these items will be seen again in a Senate version in one way or another. We did include carbon pricing. We left the discretion to the governor, but we set a timetable and we did include carbon pricing, and I believe that's something that we will be taking a look at again. We encouraged solar. We lifted the cap totally on net metering. We set strict emission limits for all sectors, including transportation, by 2040, and that's something that I believe we really need to take a look at, the transportation, which is over 40% of the emissions. We increased the percentage of renewable energy that must be purchased by retail electric suppliers under the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard. We required the administration to create a comprehensive energy plan every 3 years, put a moratorium on fracking. established a commission to study the feasibility of incentivizing and requiring the installation of solar power systems in all newly constructed housing, and required a study of the incentives for using electric vehicles, for example, allowing them to use the HOV lanes. That's just highlights of what was in the bill. The bill was over, I think, 150 pages. And as I said, it was a good first step. We ended up increasing the renewable portfolio standard, creating a statewide energy storage goal, which is important because that's something that I believe Massachusetts can take a lead on in the storage of electricity. We need to get that system down. So if we are creating more electricity through solar or offshore wind, we have a way to store it, and then we can rely less and less on any of the fossil fuels. And Massachusetts, I believe, is a center of innovation and our economy, and we can take the lead, I believe, in the nation in this area and create some terrific green jobs in the process. We authorized DOR to require distribution companies to procure up to 1,600 megawatts of additional offshore wind generation by December 2025. The Senate bill was 5,000 megawatts. So again, it's something that we will hopefully continue to build on. We also passed an act in August of 18. It was signed into law, an act promoting climate change adaptation, environmental, natural resource protection, and investment in recreational assets and opportunity. There was $2.4 billion to improve climate change resiliency and adaptation, enhances in the environmental and natural resource protection, and invests in parks and our natural resources. We coordinated and strengthened climate resilience and preparation for climate change impacts. We created and funds a Global Warming Solutions Trust Fund to support the implementation of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which I'm proud I was one of the first sponsors of that back in '08, and the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, and state and local strategies for climate adaptation. We recognize we need to help our municipalities, not only along the coast, but even here inland to plan. I do just want to mention there was another bill that was passed by the Senate in November 2017 that I'm hoping, we probably will pass again, and I'm hoping it gets enacted. It was established a comprehensive climate adaptation management action plan. It was referred to as the CAMP bill. That would codify the goals, priorities, and principles for resiliency, preservation, protection, restoration, and enhancement of the Commonwealth's built and natural infrastructure based on data around existing and projected climate change impacts, including temperature changes, drought, inland flooding, and sea rise. So these are things that I think that we need to still build on. I will leave for a little bit later what I'm hoping to accomplish. I don't file bills as Senate President, but I certainly can help support and push through other items. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Spilka. Senator Eldridge, you want to be next?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to tonight's Climate Change Forum. And Dave Doucette is Marlborough City Councilor, so someone I work very closely with, and I really want to commend him because when he was first running for City Council, he campaigned on 100% renewable energy for the city of Marlborough and really sort of raised that issue. And very proud for the second session to be refiling the 100% renewable energy bill. Very proud to be here with Senate President Spilka, Representative Gentile, Representative Robinson, and just listening to what Senate President Spilka said, if we passed what the Senate passed last session, in large part due to her leadership, both as the Senate Ways and Means Chairwoman and as Senate President, I would be very, very pleased. But to her point is that I think we need to be even bolder and look at other things as well. And so as we're looking at this session, sort of outside of the items that were in the Senate Clean Energy Bill, looking at the public transportation front. We know that if we invest more in public transportation, we can get more cars off the road, we can reduce our carbon emissions. So what steps can we take to move towards improving our commuter rail system, our regional transit system, the MBTA in general? I think that's something that we can look at, and I would argue using carbon pricing to help invest in our public transit system and in clean energy in general. I think also a big lens which has been really, I've been very influenced by the talk about the Green New Deal at the national level, is making sure to pay particular attention to equity issues and making sure that if we're passing clean energy policies that every single resident benefits from that. I am the Senate sponsor of one of the major environmental justice bills, and so I think we need to think about making sure that less well-off communities, including communities of color, benefit from the clean energy policies across Massachusetts. That's really, really critical. We all pay, for the most part, on our utility bill into various funds that fund energy efficiency programs, solar incentives, et cetera. Let's make sure that every single resident benefits from that. And then the last sort of focus that I'd really like to highlight is what steps can we take to make sure that we're reaching the goals that the legislature passed back in 2008, the Global Warming Solutions Act. There are many environmental groups that are saying we're falling behind, so what do we need to do to meet those goals? Because there's a lot of talk about the need for national leadership, and I hope that happens, but I think it's realistic to say it won't happen in at least the next couple of years. Massachusetts has been the leader on clean energy and energy efficiency policies now for over a decade, but we can't rest in our laurels. We need to keep advocating and keep fighting. I am very pleased to co-chair this session, the Clean Energy Caucus with Representative Robinson, who is an expert and I would say knows more than I do on clean energy policies. So we just kicked off the caucus just a couple weeks ago, and I will say just having this week attended a Clean Energy Center briefing, it's important to highlight. I think this is one of the things that it's important to help convince perhaps some of our other colleagues to support a clean energy future, is the thousands of clean energy jobs we have here in Massachusetts. Obviously, we don't have coal here. We don't have natural gas. We really are a successful state on a diverse economy based on very educated workforce. Part of that educated workforce is solar, is wind, is making homes and businesses more energy efficient. So let's make sure that we are continuing to create thousands of clean energy jobs, including in Metro West, which is a really strong area for the whole state on the clean energy front. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. Most of us realize that the elevated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, combined with other greenhouse gases that have already warmed the atmosphere and led to death and destruction around the globe, we're all here tonight to focus on solutions. And as as Senator Eldridge noted, that we can't expect a lot from the federal government in the next couple of years, so we have to continue to lead here in Massachusetts. I'm serving on the Energy and Environment Subcommittee in the House Progressive Caucus, and we're concentrating in this area. I've also co-sponsoring many of the House bills and some of the Senate bills, which may be noted and discussed tonight. And I've also filed a bill, a resolve establishing a commission to meet energy-neutral building standards. That's not out yet. It's still being edited by House Counsel. But a few years ago, I learned that it's possible, not only possible, but it's been going on for more than 15 years, that houses and other buildings can be built so that they're they require almost nominal amounts of energy to heat and cool them. In Massachusetts, Matthew Beaton, who at the time was a representative in the House, and now he's our energy secretary, his house in Shrewsbury was the first house built in the Commonwealth that was really a zero energy house. And I spoke to the architect that built his house last year, and he told me that he had visited a home in, it was either Switzerland or Austria, and talked with the homeowner. This was a house he'd built, 15 years ago. And the homeowner had only had to turn the heat on 3 times in 15 years. And, he explained to me that if you build these houses from scratch, it's only about 10% more than the normal cost of construction. Versus if you take a house or another structure that's already built, you might as well knock it down because it's just probably cost 100% of the construction just to retrofit it. You can't do it. So the legislation that I filed would put together a commission to determine the process to change our building standards in the Commonwealth so that moving forward in a few years, we just build everything so that it only requires normal amounts of energy. As Senator Eldridge noted, that transportation today is a major contribution to the production of greenhouse gases. And electrifying our commuter rail system and transitioning to all electric cars and trucks will greatly reduce that pollution. The Department of Transportation currently is considering electrification of the commuter rail system. They have 7 alternative plans going forward, and in the next few months they'll winnow those 7 plans down to 1 plan. But I like plan number 6. That would electrify all the commuter rail. It would also establish the link between North Station and South Station and make it a lot easier to commute. So I'm looking forward to the rest of tonight's program and turn it over to my colleague, Maria.
Thanks, Carmen, and welcome everyone to Framingham in the 6th Middlesex District. I'm happy to have you here. So when I was thinking about this discussion this evening, I want to make sure that we're taking it to the broader level of its climate legislation and not just clean energy legislation. And I do put all of these in sort of slightly different categories. Sometimes people like to say energy and environment in one really fast sentence as though it's a single word. And it's definitely a broader issue. And when I'm looking at this issue, I think about both the prevention methods, which is what a lot of what we're talking about thus far, whether it's increasing the amount of renewable energy, the amount of energy efficiency, all of that is going preventative / dealing with the fact that we have rising carbon. But then we also, at the same time, need to look at the mitigation of existing climate change and what we're doing as a Commonwealth in order to help the populations that are feeling these effects right now. A number of my colleagues live on the ocean, on rivers or on lakes, and they're seeing it immediately. I don't know if any of you had the chance to go yesterday to the MAPC Metro Commons event over at Nevins Hall, but they had this pull-out drawer where it said, what would the waters in Massachusetts look like in 2050 based on climate change? If you look at Framingham, the Sudbury River just went whew, and it became much wider, and I'm picturing houses that I know on Central Street that would be completely underwater by 2050. And we don't necessarily think of that kind of mitigation as something that we're facing this far away from the ocean. I feel like we're very far away. I used to live much further away in the middle of the country from the ocean, but these are things that we also need to be dealing with. And I think a lot of it can be some very unsexy concepts like stormwater processes and making sure that we are dealing with stormwater in a sustainable fashion. For those of you who live in Framingham and every time it rains, you know not to drive between Route 9 and 126 because it floods. But that is part of the effects of climate change, as well as a little bit of the road dipping down, that we need to start to figure out, because we're going to see that more and more in places besides that particular intersection. So I think for me, as we continue to have this conversation, it is these broader concepts that we're trying to look at and making sure that we're trying to have a really bold vision, but at the same time making sure that we're dealing with the immediate effects that we're seeing every day here at home. For me, I do have a background in clean energy and most recently worked with a number of business trade associations that were in renewable energy, places like Amoresco, that's just around the corner here. And so I think of this as an incredible economic development opportunity. Earlier today, I had the chance to go over to Sanofi Genzyme, and they were talking about the life sciences partnership and how that's an incredible public-private partnership for innovation, and that they were able to get some significant seed money. And I think we need to figure out a way as in a community of folks focused on climate change, on the environment, of how to make this an interesting enough topic. One would think it is interesting enough as it is. I, for one, in 12 years will not yet be 45, so I'm hoping that the world keeps going after that. Just saying. But figuring out if there are other ways that we can get these private entities interested in innovation on these topics. Massachusetts has done it before on different ways of advancing our economic development, and Metro West has done it particularly well. And so I want us to think about how we can both provide economic opportunity for the Commonwealth while solving one of the biggest crises that we're facing right now. So.
Thank you, folks. So there's a couple of general questions that have come up that we were thinking of ahead of time. So with these questions, you know, some of you have already commented about this within the introduction, but if you want to delve into anything deeper, what do you think are the most important things for climate change to get done legislatively this session? And what do you think are the most likely to actually get done? And how can your current committee assignments and other roles help advance the legislation? So just like general stuff. Who wants to start?
I've mentioned I've went through some of what the Senate did last year, and I think that it would be great to have a repeat of that, but yet build on it. We know that other states have done some with climate change and resiliency over the last year and a half. I think it's important to take a look at what other states have done as well. There may be different issues involved in some other states. Clearly, California, for example, doesn't have our weather yet. But I think that we need to look what are the best practices and try to incorporate them, but yet build on them through the use of Massachusetts innovation and on entrepreneurship to some extent as well, to develop solutions that will help and be specific for Massachusetts. As Senate President, what I think success will look like is the following. When we look at every policy proposal at the state level through the lens of climate change. So that's looking at our policy proposals of transportation through climate change, housing through climate change, energy, economic development, agricultural and food policy, management of our oceans and waterways throughout the state, our rivers, our streams, all of that through the lens of climate change. So when it comes to specific climate legislation, that we should be asking the question, why wouldn't we do it? Rather than why would we do it, which has sometimes been the question in the State House. Why would we do this? My question is, why wouldn't we do this? So, and that's where I believe that we do need to be bold. You know, we've all read the research that has come out of late. This is more of a crisis than I think anybody of us thought a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We have to be bold, but we also need to be pragmatic. We need to prioritize what can we realistically do in 1 or 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And we have to develop a plan for the next 20 years, looking at 50 years and the prospect of even 100 years down the line. This is for the protection of our earth and our generations. And then I believe we need to set up a framework, both in terms of funding and flexibility, which will then allow the Commonwealth to stick to that plan. We have to continue to focus. The bills that we did last year focused on, as I said, the areas of more prevention, protection, but also the resiliency and the adaptation. Otherwise, I sort of joke around about this, but it's serious. We could all have waterfront property in 30, 50 years. It may sound nice, but that's also really scary to me to think of that if we don't act. So I believe that we're in a unique political moment because the governor, the Speaker of the House, and the Senate all agree that climate change is a top priority. Even the minority leader in the Senate, Bruce Tarr from Gloucester, has said and indicated that climate change should be a top priority. And I can promise you that the top Republican in the federal Senate will not say that. So we have to work closely and work collaboratively together to move the ball forward. And I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues in the Senate, the House, the administration, all of you, to get something done. But just some ideas that we need to look and focus on: more transit-oriented development, getting people out of cars and into public transportation. We need to have transportation that's accessible, affordable, reliable, and more comprehensive than it is now. We need to look at greening the grid, electrifying everything, switch completely from combustion-based energy to electric, keeping the focus on renewables. And as I mentioned earlier, battery storage. Massachusetts really has a lot of the research, the scientific know-how. If we can crack that area, we will get thousands and tens of thousands of jobs here in Massachusetts and be a leader, and also be able to enhance our green energy and our renewables. It will create thousands of jobs in the process. We need to look at food waste, curbside compost pickup, enforce existing food waste regulations for businesses, aggressive emissions reduction standards, and RGGI for transportation, the carbon tax, and use the funds to invest in non-carbon modes of transportation. Those are some ideas. I believe that there should be nothing that is off the table when we discuss and debate this. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add. That would be incredibly exciting. So I commend the Senate President. I guess I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I do want to make sure from an equity lens is that when we pass clean energy or legislation to combat climate change, is making sure that every resident benefits from that. And I think the Senate President's comments on public transportation is particularly relevant because that is such a massive barrier for individuals that may find it difficult to get to work without an adequate public transportation system. And I'm very hopeful that we can do something on that front. Governor Baker has proposed the so-called Transportation Climate Initiative, TCI, which I find very encouraging, sort of a RGGI for transportation. I think that yields hundreds of millions of dollars over the next several years, and investing that in public transit and in perhaps clean energy is really critical. We no doubt need funding. We're serious about combating climate change and doing our part to continue to move away from fossil fuels and moving towards clean energy. So that's certainly one of the things that I'll continue to be focused on this session. And I would just say generally, and part of this speaks to what a big turnout there is tonight here on a Friday night, is that It's the public continuing to apply pressure to legislators to make sure to push us to pass strong clean energy, climate change legislation this session. So that is really critical, and I really commend you for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And, you know, the words of the Senate President, looking through the lens of climate change at everything that comes up and saying, well, what relevance does this have to climate change? What do we need to do because of climate change? And that's a powerful statement, and I think that's one that I won't forget. With housing, with transportation, with so many areas, that's what we need to do. You know, getting very granular. And one of the topics that I would consider for this session, I don't know, but I think it would be terrific if we were able to pass, if both the House and the Senate were able to pass a carbon fees or carbon tax legislation, so that we all use less fossil fuels, and some of the income, some of the revenue from that be used to pay for green infrastructure and to push us further along the road to just using clean energy and getting away from all the fossil fuels. But and I think a lot of people will be working towards that end of getting a carbon fee or carbon tax bill through, and we'll see what happens, because I think the experience that they had in British Columbia, where they returned all the fees to the people, it still decreased the use of the fossil fuels. I think we probably need to retain some of those fees, though, so that we can put it into not only moving towards use of clean energy infrastructure, but also put it towards taking housing that we already have and buildings that we already have and doing things with them so that they're more energy efficient and perhaps produce energy themselves. So, thank you.
So I'm going to react to things that each of them have said a little bit. First, agreed that the Senate President framed it really well, that everything needs to go through the lens of climate change. And in particular, I know that the Senate Global Warming Committee is really empowered to look at the different bills and really assess the impact that those bills might have on global warming writ large. And it'd be great if in the House we could see a little movement in a similar direction of considering everything. You know, in an ideal world, we want bills to have the same treatment in global warming as they would in Ways and Means, right? Just because it's just as important at the end of the day for the future of our Commonwealth. The other thing that I want to react to, Senator Eldridge said, thank you all for showing up at 7 o'clock on a Friday evening to have this conversation. And I think it's important that you show up not just at the State House, but also so many of the things that we end up legislating allows for decisions to be made further down the road by the administration, whether it's over at the Department of Energy Resources or in particular at the Department of Public Utilities or at the Department of Environmental Protection. And I think making sure that the conversations continue down those roads, because not a lot of the times we want to leave some of those decisions up to the experts that have spent, you know, a little bit of time really digging into some of these issues and not necessarily having generalist legislators make those decisions for us. But keeping that engagement going at these other agencies, I think, is incredibly important in making sure that, you know, it continues above and beyond what just happens at the legislature. And then I did have something to say about your comments as well that I've completely forgotten because I did not write them down. So I'll pass it back to the moderator.
Well, thank you anyway. Okay, so here's the next round is a couple of questions, a bunch of questions that we had. And any panelist can volunteer to, you know, say something, and then if you no one has to, not everyone's being forced to answer this one. First question is about, communities of color. The vulnerable communities, like the communities of color, bear most of the brunt of climate change and other pollution. The environmental justice is a core lens to which members of Mass Power Forward Coalition evaluate climate policies. In the last session, after getting close to passing something on environmental justice, the legislature nevertheless was unable to codify Governor Patrick's executive order on environmental justice. In this session, similar legislation has been introduced by Representatives Dubois, Madaro, Senators DiDomenico, and Eldridge. What are the chances of that legislation getting passed this year, and what do you think has to happen to make that possible?
I'm just joking a bit with Senate President Spilka because, of course, it's the beginning of session, so we don't know what's going to pass. But I would say that on the issue of environmental justice, I think it's been an interesting conversation with organizations that are active on the environmental justice front, is that I do think that one of the things that's really needed is those organizations or communities telling their stories more powerfully and having a stronger presence at the State House. Environmental justice has been talked about, for a fairly long time, but I think there needs to be more advocacy and more education because, not every legislator has a district with an EJ community. The district I represent, really doesn't. So I think that, more advocacy to raise the education level of legislators just generally is really critical. I think it's important also to understand that, and in just speaking for the Senate, is that we did pass, a very bold bill, and, the reality is that not every bill is going to become law, and that's why, every session when something doesn't pass the year before, you just get back at it and advocate. But I think, more organizations telling their stories and the impact of climate change on perhaps communities of color or poor communities is really, really critical.
Anyone else want to say anything? Okay. Good. Next question. Governor Baker has announced joining a regional transportation initiative. We're worried that it won't do enough to A, reduce transportation emissions, and B, adequately support those who may be most impacted by the increased cost of transportation fuels. Should the legislator have a role in pushing the governor here, either through Representative Brenson's carbon pricing bill or Representative Ehrlich's legislation to create a transportation climate initiative commission, or both?
I just want to say that's why you have the executive branch and you have the legislative branch. The governor sometimes does things that he can do on his own, he or she, hopefully at some point, can do on their own. But the legislature has the authority to make policy and pass it, and then it's up to the governor to implement it. He can try to veto it, and then we override it, and then he has to implement it. So, I'm glad the governor is taking that step, though. I think that it's something that shows he's willing to look at new ways of combating climate change. But I believe that the legislature, both the House and the Senate, will be doing bills this session that will be pushing that forward and pushing other things. And I do want to mention, I know Rep. Benson has a carbon pricing, but Senator Michael Barrett is a very, very strong proponent of carbon pricing. In fact, that is, if you haven't met him, and it's great because he's willing to look at all aspects and compromise, but this is the biggest thing for him. So, and he pushed us in the Senate, and we included it in our bill last session. But again, we will be revisiting it. It may be the same, it may be a little different. We'll have to take a look as to how it evolves, but that's the beauty of it. The governor can implement some things through regulation. We do it through policy and passing laws.
Anyone else?
I'd just like to say, whatever the governor can put together for the legislature to look at, that's terrific. This governor's conference with the states in the Northeast, some of the advocates, some of the interest groups, before the governor came out and said, well, we'll look and see what we're going to do in the next year, were apprehensive that they were going to give themselves 2 years to come up with something rather than 1 year. And regardless of how long they look at it and come up with something, the legislature will just push forward with what we have, and whoever gets there first. Whatever rises up, and it's not one road to success. It's different paths.
Okay. Next question. Speaker of the House, Robert DeLeo, had just proposed a $1 billion bond program for energy efficiency grants and other efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change. What are your first impressions of that proposal, and does that change the agenda for the climate change legislation in this session?
Well, I think it's a terrific proposal because it empowers every city and town in the Commonwealth to, and each city and town knows what it needs best, and it gives the cities and towns, it empowers them to be able to do things that are good for them on climate change. And it's really a modest amount of money, $100 million a year. How it will be funded, I don't know, maybe from the marijuana revenue, who knows? But I don't see it affecting other programs at all, really.
Okay.
Yeah, I view that more on the mitigation side of things, of helping resiliency efforts, but not necessarily changing the trajectory of any of the other either carbon pricing or renewable energy efforts that are happening at the State House. I sort of think of that as being in conjunction with, as opposed to competing with. And so we want to make sure that, this is based off of something that I think Governor Patrick proposed back in 2008. And that was at $1 billion for 10 years back in 2008. So my hope is that we can keep pushing to increase that amount because we've experienced the effects of climate change significantly more over these past 10 years.
Okay.
So I think on the one hand, I commend Speaker DeLeo. I'm not using this right. I commend Speaker DeLeo for looking to tackle and perhaps fund climate resiliency. I do think this is a nuance where it's really important for people to pay close attention, because there is a difference between mitigation and climate resiliency and energy policy. Bonding money to perhaps provide to cities and towns to make their different town buildings or schools or public infrastructure climate resilient, that's a good thing. It might not necessarily combat climate change per se. We really need to be focused on expanding subsidies for solar, for wind, looking at carbon pricing, moving towards 100% renewable energy. Those are different things from bonding money for climate resiliency. And part of the conversation, which I think is important to think about, and this is in some ways I think the difference between the Baker-Polito's approach to climate change and the legislatures, is that the Baker-Polito administration, one of their mantras is local government knows best. And in many ways they might be right, but the challenge is, if we're really serious about tackling climate change, We need a statewide approach, and the reality is not every city or town doing their own thing, whether it works or doesn't work. That's not really going to tackle climate change if we're really serious about meeting our carbon emissions goals that are set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So it's important to think about all these different proposals through the lens of, is this actually going to reduce our carbon emissions, or is this something that will make a institution or infrastructure climate resilient, but is it going to reduce carbon emissions or move more towards 100% clean energy? And those are important things to think about as we're looking at all these bills.
Thank you. So I got one other general question, which is actually my own personal one. How do you see, or do you see that there's an option in the future for the state for alternative energy sources, non-renewable, such as fusion, molten salt reactors? And there's a couple of spin-offs from MIT and other businesses. I mean, are they in the equation at all? Are they on your radar screens at all as far as, looking for radical technologies? It's like MIT's got some interesting proposals if you want to go check them out.
As I said before, I don't think anything should be off the table, but a lot of those are still in research stages, so it's hard to see how that might transfer into something statewide. And then looking at, in the beginning, so often it's very expensive to implement new ideas. So I think that we need to keep that dialogue going and look at how they are developing that, whether it be technology or, there's a lot of research going on, and I think that there's a lot of potential. And as we've said, Massachusetts is a hotbed for all of this going on. So we will be hearing from a lot of the researchers and the companies that are doing all of this research and seeing if there are ways to blend it in. I apologize, I need to go, but I want to thank you all so much for inviting us. This is a great, great forum. I look forward to working with all of you and seeing you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Spilka. Okay. So anyone else want to make any comment on that or not?
I think the one thing that we shouldn't let ourselves wrap our minds around is the idea that there's a single silver bullet. And I think sometimes when you get into the idea of perhaps there is this one technology out there that can save us all, it's going to ultimately be a hodgepodge of things and a very different electricity system than what we've been doing for a while. We've spent the past 100 years subsisting on coal, and then in the past 20 years did this gigantic flip over to natural gas because it ended up being cheaper. And we've been doing this monolithic energy source dance for a really long time. And I think we need to wrap our heads around the fact that it's going to take a wide range of technologies to get us there. But the hope is that with R&D and the continuing innovation out of places like Cambridge, that we should be able to find ways to make this continually cheaper. But it's really funny. I've been working with policymakers for a very long time, and they understand a solar panel, but it's really hard sometimes to think about energy efficiency or less tangible concepts. Like you show them insulation in a house, and it's somehow just really hard to think about that, and it involves math. And people have told me that math makes climate change legislation hard, and I'm here to help. But the hope is that if we can get them, really immersed in ideas like solar, because that's something that they see it on their neighbor's house, that we're able to bring them into these more complex conversations as we move forward.
Thank you. Okay, actually, the next question is for you, Representative Robinson. As the House recently readopted its internal operating rules for the legislative session, you offered a series of rule changes aimed at making the House operations more transparent and accountable to the public. What drove you as a first-time state rep to pursue the rules reform in the House, and what lessons should we learn from how that turned out as we try to pursue a more transparent House?
there's no time like the present. I don't have a whole lot of time to waste. I don't know. We don't know if we're going to be here in 12 years, you know? So for me, making sure that on our first round of session, looking at the rules, if we can, I think that government works best when it's driven by the people at the end of the day, and driven by all of you who take the time out of your day to get involved, to understand legislation, to follow the House bill numbers. And the more that we can get people actively involved, I think we will ultimately have a better government at the end of the day. And so for me, that's why transparency was particularly important, because the more time that's available to look at bills, to read them, to have conversations with all of you about them and be able to reach out and discuss, will ultimately create a better product. That's my personal philosophy, and so I think that that's something that we will continue to strive to work towards, and the gentleman over here was a part of that as well. And so I think it's just important that we keep trying to find ways to make government more accessible, whether, you know, Senator Becker Rausch and I have been talking, and now that I'm saying it in front of cameras, I guess we actually have to do it, is, you know, these series of videos of just explaining to people how a bill becomes a law, you know, basic schoolhouse rock style, because there are people who stop me and ask these questions, people who before 2016 were not interested at all and are now having in-depth conversations about, you know, the appointments that happen in DC, and now they want to start understanding what happens at the state level. So, you know, lots of lessons to be learned and ways that we can continue to get active, but I think, again, it's about citizen participation as much as possible, and making sure that your voices are heard with your legislators, and so we appreciate that.
Oh, you know, it's really not that complicated. It's just that, you know, in the Senate, they have a whole week to look at legislation that they're going to vote on the next week, and so they, you know, look over it, and it's great. So we have at least 2 hours. In the House.
Okay, next question. This is actually for Senator Eldridge. What components of the Senate Omnibus Bill, if any, do you see coming back in this session with a realistic chance of passage? And is there any component where you think there may be enough overlap support in the House for passage?
I'm not sure what legislation will have the chance to pass this session, but as I think we've all talked about tonight, I think there's just much more momentum for taking action on climate change and investing more in clean energy in Massachusetts. And, you know, that could be everything from frustration that there wasn't, you know, enough legislation passed last session to
Try holding it. Don't grab the don't hold the bottom.
Okay, thank you, guys. So everything from frustration that the legislation that passed last session wasn't particularly strong, to the UN climate change report add some more urgency, to just amazing movements, including the Sunrise Movement, which very proud that one of the founders and the executive director, Varshini Prakash, is a constituent of mine from the town of Acton, and is doing great work across the country, and hopefully will have a presence on the state legislature as well. So I think the young people are certainly more engaged, and, you know, I think, you know, again, as we've all said, just that everyone's out here on a Friday night really shows, you know, your commitment. And I think it's absolutely possible that every component of the Senate bill, you know, can pass. I also think that, you know, many legislators are looking to pass even stronger legislation. I think one of the things that was really exciting is that there were so many more pieces of legislation filed this session on clean energy and combating climate change. So it's used to be a relatively small number of legislators. That's really grown, and it's wonderful to see, and to see first legislators like Representative Robinson come in and already have a real handle on clean energy and climate change is very encouraging, and that's really how things change.
Thank you. Next question is for Representative Carmine Gentile. Over the course of your previous 2 terms in the House, you had consistently voted with the progressives in the House. Given the shifts of House leadership and the role of House progressives in pushing Representative Khan's RPS amendment in the last term, will the Progressive Caucus continue to push a more unified and aggressive position on the climate this session?
So we have more progressive members in the House in this session than we had in the last session. And so I'm optimistic that our caucus will continue to push aggressively for climate legislation, and looking forward to the session.
Was it that, so Representative Jack Lewis couldn't be here, and he sends his regards and his regrets, but he recently made the comment that Framingham may have actually the most progressive House delegation in the entire Commonwealth. So we recognize the responsibility that you've given us to make sure that we push hard, for sure.
Okay. You guys have questions?
Yeah. 4 people asked versions of the same question.
Okay.
So which version should we pick? This is one version.
Take the English one.
That's the strongest. There's a related version.
That's, okay. Yeah, this doesn't have any names associated with it. Okay.
It's a name.
Yeah, I know. Okay. What do you see as the greatest obstacle to Massachusetts actually reducing emissions as fast as needed? And is that obstacle the Speaker of the House?
So the actual answer to this question is the fact that emissions know no boundaries, right? No physical boundaries, or political boundaries. So even if Massachusetts does absolutely everything that it possibly can, and the Speaker of the House decides that he wants to pass all 240 climate change-related pieces of legislation that were filed this year, it doesn't change the fact that we live in a country, and we live in a world, and that there's still that larger component that needs to happen. It's one of the things that I worked on in my previous life is this clean power plan under the Obama administration that would have reduced power plant emissions across the country, really focusing on getting rid of coal plants, right? That's something New England has done ages ago, but at this point, there's still plenty of coal plants in the rest of the country, and that's really problematic, and looking at gas pipelines as sort of the next big issue of figuring out ways that we can continue to service different parts of the Commonwealth. You may have seen that there have been gas shortages in the western part of the state that's not allowing for houses to be hooked up to gas because there's shortages, and people are saying that's an argument for increasing the number of pipelines. I say that means we should be actually reducing the amount of natural gas that we use to allow everybody to have a smaller share. I filed a bill to do a natural gas demand response pilot program, and I know that there's a number of other very progressive, no new pipeline issues, and I think that's actually the next really big hurdle that we're facing, because we are so dependent on natural gas as we shifted away from both coal and nuclear relatively quickly, that we also want heat in the middle of winter, and that's somewhat unpredictable. So there's some larger changes that need to happen at the ISO New England, which is starting to get real nerdy, talking about that, to stop incentivizing the use of natural gas for electric purposes. That needs to happen, which is a little bit above our pay grade on a day-to-day basis, but is still something that, people need to be paying attention to, and we as legislators need to make sure that the governor is paying attention to as he and his administration participates in those conversations at the regional level. So you framed the question in a way that, made me want to step right into that answer, but
Well,
I think it is actually a much bigger issue than Massachusetts on its own.
I mean, I would say that I think the biggest challenge on Beacon Hill to tackling climate change and investing in clean energy is really corporate special interests. And it's really, really critical to remember, that there are lobbyists for every utility company. There are lobbyists for, natural gas pipelines. And these are full-time lobbyists that are up at the State House basically every day. And I know that, not all of you and not every sort of volunteer-based organization can be at the State House every day, but showing up for rallies, having forums like this, and just letting legislators know that you're watching very closely, what we're doing, I think will have a dramatic impact. But there's no doubt that if you look at corporate special interests, absolutely has an impact on elected officials. One of the things that 350 Mass has really focused on is asking legislators to commit to not taking any fossil fuel money. And I think all three of us have taken that pledge. So, but that is just so critical because I always say that it's not so much the donation to elected officials from their source that per se influences them. It's more just that it creates a conversation or perhaps a greater willingness to interact with that person. And if that increases the chances that, you're talking to a corporate lobbyist on these issues, I personally think it's going to impact, the policies that legislators pursue. So I really hope that every legislator, and not just Democrats, Republicans too, are taking this fossil fuel-free donation pledge. Thank you.
Thank you. So there was another open question that I'll do it now. Just in light of the Merrimack Valley incidents, what do you think the legislators should do and will do about natural gas pipelines and natural gas infrastructure in the state?
Yeah, there's the gas explosions and the tragedies that happen in Merrimack Valley are just outrageous and unacceptable. And I think someone said, maybe we should rethink the idea of, sending to every home a source of power that can explode. So I think what you've seen is that a whole host of legislators have filed bills on this subject, especially in the Merrimack Valley. I've filed legislation over the past few years on gas leaks, and we've made some progress. But the reality is, the utility companies, do the bare minimum, or they're such monopolies, and their bureaucracy is so frustrating that often it's hard to get them to focus on sealing or closing gas leaks. So I have filed a piece of legislation around that. I think many other legislators have as well. I think there's a very good chance, and it's a little twisted to say, but it's true on a number of topics. But when there's a tragedy, when there's when someone dies, when someone is harmed, it does push elected officials to take stronger action. And so I think because a young man lost his life for the Merrimack Valley gas explosion from Lawrence, because there were a lot of scary stories, I think there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the legislature to pass legislation. And of course, it's all of those corporate interests that'll be fighting back and trying to stop that legislation. So we need your voices focused on tackling gas leaks and the utility companies as well.
So the gas companies have been allowing these leaks forever. They grade the leaks 1, 2, and 3. One is it's in a habitated, it's in a house, or it's in a structure where there are human beings and it's leaking, so that they go and they fix it. And then number 2, well, maybe it's a foot away from the house or building. It's something they need to get to, but they don't have to do it today. And number 3 is over near the sidewalk, by some trees that are dying, and they're never going to go there. Those are the number 3s, because they're never going to go there because they pose no risk to human beings, no risk of blowing up. But what they do is they kill the vegetation, they kill the trees, they kill the shrubs. And I remember years ago, someone talked to me about it and drove me around and showed me. And I got to the point where I could actually tell where there was a gas leak because just the way the vegetation was dying or dead. And Attorney Jan Schlichtman took a case to basically go after the gas companies for all the property law, all the trees that they killed on public property. I think in the city of Framingham, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars, $1 million worth of trees that have probably died from gas. I don't know what the status of the Framingham settling on that is. But there is, as Senator Eldridge pointed out, there's legislation. There's Representative Lori Ehrlich and Christine Barber filed legislation that all three of us at the table have co-sponsored, which would force the gas companies to fix leaks in any stretch of road where a significant length of road is being redone, repaved. They'd be obligated to go and fix any leaks in that stretch. But and there are other bills. Oh.
No, that was for, no, thank you.
Okay. So,
Yes.
okay. So, there are other bills, as was pointed out, to address the leak situation. And, it's really bad because the natural gas combines with, it's like 20 times worse a greenhouse gas than CO2. Yeah. So, if they just fixed all the leaks, that would be huge for, yeah.
So my failing of the month is that we're redoing our kitchen. And we tried so hard to convince my family to go completely induction cooktop, right? And get rid of gas entirely. And we ended up with a compromise where we now have an induction cooktop and a gas range, which is a little much. But I think making sure that people are aware of technologies like induction cooktops and helping make that more mainstream and until you can see it in your average Home Depot and not have to order it special online, and using your pocketbook when you're trying to make these kinds of decisions and hopefully be more successful than me getting outvoted by the other 5 people in my house to make that decision. But making sure that you're letting other people know and educating them about that, because I think that could be a real movement in that direction. I just read a story yesterday about how a Michelin 5-star restaurant in London is now using induction cooktops and reducing the number of burns that they have in the kitchen, and they're finding like real significant success with using that. So if they can start doing it, then perhaps we can, continue to reduce our cooking reliance on gas.
It seems that our current utilities, the National Grid and National Grid and Eversource, they're like, 2 sides of a coin. Sometimes they're doing gas and electric in one, and the next city over, it's electric and gas. So there doesn't seem to be much difference between the two from the utilities' perspective, even though there's radically different technologies. It appears, though, that those two technologies, natural gas and electricity, are about the same price, and don't think that that's coincidental, because they don't want one to overly compete against the other. But one of the questions that came up is, should we take back control of the utilities into public hands? Who wants to hit that one?
You want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, I think it would be difficult to entirely, at least at the state level, to take over utilities. I certainly don't feel that the deregulation that happened in the 1990s, was all a good thing. As a senator that represents a district that has a couple of muni power facilities, Hudson and Littleton, I've certainly seen how the service is generally better. Leaks are closed more quickly. However, muni power, right now are not subject to the Global Warming Solutions Act, and so often they often rely even more sometimes on fossil fuels. So, I know that there has been legislation filed in the past that would allow cities and towns to sort of buy the wires and poles and create muni power. I would certainly support that. I would also acknowledge it's incredibly expensive. I think, you know, for an average town, it would be tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. But certainly, I think that the state needs to have more power, more control, more regulation over utilities. And this is where, you know, the DPU is really run roughshod. You know, the DPU in Governor Baker's first term, you know, tried to allow utilities to charge all of us, the ratepayers, to build natural gas pipelines, including the Kinder Morgan pipeline that was going to go through some of the northern communities I represent. So, and to her great credit, Attorney General Moore Healy, you know, took the DPU to court and said that was unconstitutional. So, I think there needs to be more regulation. You know, it's extremely disappointing, but I think we have a very pro-fossil fuel governor, and that's reflected in, you know, who is head of the DPU. That's reflected in the fact that, you know, I think at the end of the day, there's more of a focus on development, but not looking at the impacts of climate change. And that's where, you know, Senate President Spilka talking earlier about making sure that every single agency, every single policy we tackle, looking at it through the lens of climate change is so critical. I know in my hometown of Acton, there's a real push, which is gaining some success, to convince the town to not approve any more development if it's based on natural gas or fossil fuel, and to say that, look, if you're going to build more housing, if you're going to create more commercial buildings, then it has to be built, you know, powered by solar or other sources of alternative energy. So I think that movement is growing. There was a lot of discussion about that in the city of Boston as well, where development is just, you know, booming even greater than this area. So those are some of my scattered thoughts on the question. Thank you.
David had to leave, so I'd like to ask the next question that was on there. What would it take to get every school project to be required to be solar or energy producing, or any government that's any building that's partially government funded?
So now I will put in a plug for Jack's bill because he asked me to do that, and also because it is relevant to this question. He and Representative Mike Connolly put together a bill that said any new construction, not just in school buildings and elsewhere, all new construction has to have solar on it. It's a solar mandate so all we need to do is pass that bill. Simple answer. There you go. But I think that, you know, that is the ideal view. If we can even just have it be for government-funded facilities, that would be a huge first step. And we'd love to see something like that happen in this session, for sure.
The next question is, if you're committed to bold 100% renewable clean energy plan, will you support a moratorium on all new gas pipelines?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. The Attorney General, you know, commissioned an independent study to see, you know, do we need some new pipelines for our needs? And they came back and said, no. I mean, for the next 30 years, you're not going to need it. And after that, you shouldn't. I mean, but we should be transitioning away during the next 30 years. So no new pipelines. And if a gas company wants to build a pipeline, they do it at their expense, not the consumer's expense. They can do it at their stockholders' expense. Yeah.
So the bigger issue we're facing, again, is with ISO New England. Their CEO is doing sort of a tour around and talking with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission about how we will be constrained and they won't be able to produce enough electricity to meet demand unless we build new gas pipelines over the next couple of years. So we have to continue to fight that narrative, and part of that is the duty of the state legislature to make sure that there are additional resources, including making sure that all of the technology and there's a lot of technical aspects to the offshore wind that still need to be worked out, and we have to not let those get in the way of allowing offshore wind to come and be a massive resource to us in the New England area in terms of production. There's a lot of conversation right now about who's going to pay for new transmission for certain parts of offshore wind, and there's a lot of struggle between the utilities and between the developers about how that's going to get paid for, but I just want it paid for some way, shape, or form, and quickly, so we can move on and actually get those connected.
I have a small follow-up question. Is there anything the legislator can do to stop the compressor in Weymouth?
We had several legislators go out there and in the rain and in the cold and protest that, and that's will be an ongoing effort, I believe. Yeah.
The entire South Shore delegation got on a letter, Republicans, Democrats, everybody is opposed to it, and it's just a question of that particular DEP permit ended up going through, so I think that I'm not sure if the Attorney General is looking at it at all and potentially getting in, but I know that she struggles sometimes with agency deference at the courts, so people are doing what they can at this point.
Next one is, in reference to carbon tax, why not pass a law to increase the gasoline tax by a few cents every year for the next 10 to 20 years?
So we want to be using less and less and less gasoline. So if we had a tax on it, the revenue would be less and less and less. And we did, I think the legislature raised the gas tax a few years ago for the first time in like 19 years. And, right away, my former representative whose office was on the other side of the wall from mine, led the successful fight to overturn that at the ballot box. So it's gone. So we tried that, and it didn't work. I mean, the people didn't like it. So I think we need to raise money some other way.
I would just add, and I was then also a senator when we voted to raise the gas tax, and yeah, we didn't raise it enough, and then we indexed it, and that's exactly what Carmine is referring to as the indexing was repealed at the ballot, and so I do think it speaks to the fact that people who are concerned deeply about climate change, we really need to be strategic about how we look at carbon pricing, because it's possible that it's something that if it really hurts working class families, that it could be something that the public could oppose or it could be repealed at the ballot. And so that's really how we have to think strategically about this. If we want to raise revenue, we want to put a price on carbon, which I absolutely support, but how do we do it in a smart way that it's not easy to repeal, or that it doesn't, the burden doesn't fall most on those who can least afford it.
And here's another question that says, is the legislation, or either legislature or the House, considering pairing ongoing upcoming NPDES requirements with an opportunity to install solar PVV on carports and charging stations in parking lots?
Very specific question. My goodness. It's too late for that. Next question.
On the theme of equality in energy and climate, the Green Communities Program now includes more than half of the state's population. The remaining population centers are not green communities or gateway cities. Is this likely due to the lack of staff capacity within those local governments? How are the current bills looking at building capacity to address climate change in the gateway cities?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that, Carmen just said the equity piece is that, I do think that is the challenge and part of the difficult conversation about, talking about tackling climate change is that, I look at the communities I represent, in which communities of the 14 have the Community Preservation Act and which don't. And more often than not, it's the working class communities that haven't passed the CPA because it is a greater burden, on perhaps a more, modest homeowner than who's upper middle class. So in that same sense, That's probably a similar thing that's happening with the Green Communities Act, in which communities adopt those policies. And I think that's where, respectfully, I think the environmental community as a whole needs to do a lot better job, and I certainly need to do a lot better job too, about how do we reach out to communities of color, how do we organize in less well-off communities to talk about, the impact of climate change and the value of clean energy policies, because it can't just be upper middle class white communities that are, combating climate change or sort of taking the lead. It's every community, and I think we need to do a better job of, outreach and organizing and reaching out perhaps to gateway cities to talk about the benefits of these policies.
I'd like to thank the panelists, but it's time for our panel to end. I'd like to thank all the people that attended and participated in asking questions. And thank you very much, and go get them.
And if I could just have everyone's attention very quickly, I just wanted, and I'll hand out the flyer, but, and Representative Robinson is going to be part of this, is that I work with many organizations, including 350 Mass. Oh, Paul Garver already has the flyer. Okay. You beat me. We're having a What Would a Massachusetts Green New Deal Look Like forum on Wednesday, March 13th at the Hudson Portuguese Club. It is sponsored by Progressive Mass, Metro West Democratic Socialists of America, 350 Mass, Young Democrats of Massachusetts, Our Revolution, Metro West, and Massachusetts Sierra Club. So Representative Robinson will be one of the panelists. So I hope you can come, because I do think there's a real exciting conversation going on now about the Green New Deal and what that would look like if that's actually implemented in Massachusetts. Paul Garver is one of the co-organizers, is going to hand out flyers, as well as Michael Gilbraith, and hope to see you there. Thank you.